So without much further ado, I'm going to let my work speak for me, because that's usually the best way to do things. And lots of slides to keep you amused, because, you know, as I'm getting older, I'm now starting to look like my Uncle Frank, so not very attractive at all. So hundreds of thousands of years, humans have dwelt as cave dwellers, and suddenly, mysteriously, around 8000 BC, we discovered civilization. It's an incredible anomaly that historians are struggling with. And the fact is that humanity's sudden development was itself the subject of an investigation commissioned by NASA, which pointed to a disturbing trend in evolved civilizations suddenly appearing completely developed about 10,000 years ago, and to technology and agriculture and science and mathematics and astronomy suddenly manifesting in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt and Yucatan, Peru, Japan, and China. So the question is, was this a mass inspiration that humans had, or did we inherit this from somebody else? Well, because at this same moment in time, there appear stories of unusual people possessing skills far and beyond the capacity of hunter-gatherers. And they arrive in groups of 7, led by an 8th, a charismatic leader, and these groups kickstart civilization. So who were these gods and where did they come from? Well, to begin with, we're no strangers to lands lost to a flood 11,000 years ago. We talk about it all the time, and you know the names very well. Lemuria and Atlantis are always at the top of the list. But I always wondered, have we talked about these so much that we have actually forgotten that there were other land masses where the gods used to live? I think we've actually limited ourselves in our exploration of this topic. So how do land masses just disappear? That's the first question we're going to ask ourselves. Well, it turns out that we don't have to look very far to find these missing land masses. All you have to do is go back to 1789 in the middle of the Pacific. And I promise you that the rest of the presentation will not consist of these maps of Google with little pins on them. 1789, the St. Vincent Islands were found between Baja and Tahiti. And there's actually a ship's account of 12 days spent there, which describes the islands providing a good harbor. They're moderately elevated, about 20 miles in circumference, well wooded and abounding with coconuts and fur seals. Well, the next captain to sail there 30 years later spent 46 days surveying the coordinates and found nothing but discolored water to a depth of 720 feet. In 30 years, all these islands vanished beneath the waves. And then there's the case of Davis Island, 500 miles southwest of South America, a land so large it stretched beyond the horizon, and it was actually added to naval charts in 1687. Well, a Dutch captain sailing to Australia went looking for it 35 years after it was originally found, and he discovered, again, nothing. It was no longer above sea level. The name of this captain was Jacob Roggeveen, and don't feel too bad for him because he sailed on and he stumbled upon Easter Island by accident, the first Europeans to find this very small island. And 2 other islands were said to exist near Easter Island, and they even appeared on naval maps in 1912, and they too vanished within 20 years, failed to be found by the US Navy no less after a 3-week fruitless search. So the point of this is that the Earth is an unstable, unpredictable, and evolving planet. And you know what? So is our solar system, because ancient astronomers were under no illusion that the orbits and velocities of planets are absolute. They are instead subject to change, and they forewarn future people of the Earth of the chaos that these variations bring upon our planet. One of them being the obliteration of all traces of former civilizations by meteorites. There is an account by an Egyptian priest that describes his culture experience over 35,000 years. The Egyptians have been around much longer than we give them credit for, and they wrote everything down and gave the information to people who were visiting Egypt. And here it is what this priest told a visitor about 2,500 years ago. He said, and I quote, "The change in the rising and the setting of the sun and the other heavenly bodies, how in those times they used to set in the quarter where they now rise, and used to rise where they now set. At certain points, the Earth revolves in the reverse direction. And of all the changes which take place in the heavens, this reversal is the greatest and most complete. Now, that's quite a hell of a statement to make. This priest was talking to a Greek historian called Solon, who was visiting the temple of Sais back in the day. And he took the knowledge of all these past catastrophes back to Greece, and he shared them with a young man called Plato, who then goes on to write the story we know so well about Atlantis under a kind of a fictional environment. He mythologized it. But it's a wonderful technique, mythology, because most people don't understand that mythology is a great way to impart important information wrapped in a theatrical device. That way, you will be bound to remember the story. And of course, we do. Now, one such event that the Egyptians were describing actually took place in 10,800 BC. The Earth was actually hit by a fragmented meteor, and we have found many of the impact points today. And this is the event that led to the last ice age called the Younger Dryas. And you've heard about this on social media and videos for the last, last decade at least. It seems to be an obsession at the moment. And ancient cultures claim that this event is what reversed the Earth's rotation. Even the Hopi describe this event. The Younger Dryas lasted about 900 years before yet another meteor event happened in 9,700 BC. Well, this new event is what generated a global flood. And the tsunami are actually mentioned penetrating deep into Asia. In fact, the waves were claimed by the Tibetans to have reached Tibet itself. That's over 3 miles high. That's some very, very big waves. If you look at some of the stories from the Pacific Northwest, the tribes there also describe the waves crossing the Cascades, the Olympics, and the Rocky Mountains. If we talk to the Shiglit and the Shokomish and the Yakima, and I hope you remember this because there'll be a test at the end, they talk about how their canoes were flung atop one mountain called Mount Jefferson. Now, Mount Jefferson is 10,000 feet high. So again, you can imagine the scale of the event that these people faced. Now, where is the evidence for these incredible waves crossing the North American continent? Well, it's right in front of you. It's called the Great Salt Lake. The saltiness, it turns out, is said to be derived from mineral salts accumulating from the streams that flow into the Great Salt Lake. But there's a problem with this theory. The problem is that the salt in the Great Salt Lake is composed of sea salt. It had to be deposited there, not by rivers, but by waves coming out of the Pacific and also probably from the north. And the change in salinity actually occurred about 10,000 years ago, which is roughly around the same time that the tsunamis from the flood overran the Rocky Mountains and the Central Plains. There are over 180 surviving flood myths around the world, and they all share identical details. They talk about large burning rocks falling from the sky, and they fell in ocean areas, which then caused a global flood. And in Egypt, there's a book called The Building Texts in the Temple of Edfu, and they vividly describe a parallel pre-flood civilization whose architects were magicians. They had complete control of the forces of nature, and they're also capable of building enormous monuments with as easily as you and I can stack 2 bricks together. And after the flood, their survivors reappeared at strategic locations, and I quote, to rebuild the former world of the gods. So many of the ancient structures that we see today are actually mirror copies of the world that they lost beneath the waves. And their handiwork is actually everywhere, if you care to look. Here's a very rare photograph of on the cover of Science News from 1965, I believe it was. I think I was 4 years old back then, and I still remember it. This shows a row of stone columns. It's a photograph, and the columns are said to bear inscriptions made by human hands. And you think, well, nothing unusual about that. Well, the problem is that they were found 55 miles off the coast of Peru, 6,000 feet below the present sea level. That's where the problem begins. These things are found in places where they shouldn't be. And of course, there are the examples above water as well. For example, megaliths that are completely out of proportion on tiny Pacific islands. And the Pacific is probably the best place to search for lost gods and their missing lands. Here's one place. Few have ever heard of a people called the Waitaha. Well, it turns out that they are Easter Island's indigenous people, and they carry a very important oral tradition that was only published recently. And they said that they lived on Easter Island, and I quote, when the stars shone in a different sky and a different pattern. In other words, they were there during a time when the precessional cycle of the Earth moved, had the stars positioned in the sky in a completely different part of the sky. And they describe their time in Easter Island as the lands and outer islands of Waitangi Kiraro, which is their name for Easter Island. So in other words, they lived on Easter Island when it was an archipelago. It was a group of islands, which of course it isn't today. Now, reading their accounts is an extraordinary adventure. They talk about how every year the Waitaha welcomed the appearance of the double-hulled canoe of the gods. And they called these gods the Uruku. They were essentially, it means the people, the red people, or the people with red hair. And they describe these people as star walkers, long distance voyagers. And the Uruku was said to travel regularly across the Pacific. But one year, the canoe failed to return when, and I quote, angry stars gathered close to the moon to give birth to the tides of chaos, the dreaded deluge. Now, that's a very important marker in the story because it places the account around 10,000 BC at the close of the Younger Dryas. Like Aboriginal people in Australia, the Waitaha have a very long memory of events. The question is, where were these Uruku headed to? They were headed to a place called Aotearoa, otherwise known to you and I as New Zealand. And 2 generations after the world turned by water, which is their term, a descendant of these Uruku, is a female by the name of Hotu Matua. So just for once, we have a female hero of the story. She arrives back on Easter Island after the flood consumed her original homeland. And together with 7 sages, she was in charge of remapping the Pacific and all of its missing lands, which of course had now become islands. Well, the Uruku were described as very tall, light-skinned, red-haired with green eyes, and sometimes blonde with blue eyes. And they also had beards. And on the picture on the left, you can still see the earliest moai, the description, well, the showing of a very nice little goatee. It's actually very stylish, and it goes all the way around the chin. Well, it turns out that it is their image that is depicted in the oldest moai. And even the extended chins were designed to show and demonstrate that they had beards, which in many parts of the Pacific, it is impossible for men to actually have beards. Even Peru and parts of South America, men to this day cannot have beards. It's a physical impossibility. Now, these red-haired people gives you a bit of an understanding as to why they carved these big monoliths, and then they went to all the trouble of finding a very different type of stone called red scoria, and they carved it and placed these red cylinders on their head. And they said that it's to depict their hair color. And I find the story very compelling because it would have been much easier to carve these hats out of the same stone in one go, rather than looking through red volcanic rock around Easter Island, carving it and then putting it on top of the heads of these sometimes 42-foot tall structures. So although the Waitaha account is over 11,000 years old, there is actually no mention of erecting the moai. They are already an established fact, which leads us now to the speculation that they are much older than accounted for. The current philosophy, the orthodox philosophy, is that they're only about 800 years old, which anybody in the Pacific just completely laughs at. And there's some new evidence to suggest that in the carbon-14 record that they're actually far, far older than they've been assumed to be. Well, let's move the story a little bit forward. After the world turned by water, the grandchildren of the gods, they set sail from Easter Island back to New Zealand to locate the birthplace of the gods. And there it is on that little yellow dot on the South Island. And it is here that we find 3 sites which are described by the Dalai Lama himself as the spiritual center of the universe. Not the earth, but the universe. And that's quite a big claim. And here is the center of those three sites. This is called Tekohanga, which means the sacred nest or the crucible of the world. So what you're looking at here is the birthplace of the gods, according to the Waiha tradition. And having been there 6 times now, I can't get enough of this place. It's a place I absolutely adore and have researched and walked myself many, many times. If you look carefully, it looks like a primordial mound, and it was once actually surrounded by a glacial lake. You can still see the area where the water used to, where the water level used to be, right up to its base. So it very much resembles the kind of mound that rises out of the waters of chaos in so many traditions. And if you were to stand in the middle of this this mound, you would look across back to where I'm taking the picture to the second location, which is this. This is Kura-Ti from where I've just taken the picture on top of the hill. And it means distant school. And each stone along this ridge is said to hold the entire wisdom of the Uruku. In other words, it is an outdoor academy. And the information was said to have been carved into the stones by a group of people called the Keepers of the Stone, for which the Waitaha have a wonderful description. These people were able to shape stone without breaking its spirit. What a wonderful description. And in fact, if you read the story in the Waitaha narrative, they said, huge are the sacred monuments we carved at Tekohanga. And I'm not surprised. The first time I ever went there without actually realizing this story was even available, it never occurred to me that these were natural eroded stones, which resemble features like a face, as the one you're seeing right now, and animals and so forth. That does exist in nature. I always assumed these to have been the remains, the weathered remains of previously carved images, and I was proved correct when I read their account about a year later. Well, the most prominent monument is of their tutelary goddess, and her name is Martine, and here she is in all her glory. It's a big stone. It looks like an eroded sphinx, doesn't it? You can still see the eye sockets, the mouth, and of course, it's very eroded after at least 10,000 years of rain. Let me describe to you what they wrote about this particular stone. Excuse me. A towering column of the purest stone was shaped to place Martine on the land. We asked so much of the stone shapers when they carved her to stand against the stars. Tall timbers and thick ropes lifted them high above the land to carve Martine. Ever higher they climbed to cut away the curving charcoal lines to reveal the beauty of our ancestor. Beautiful place. Well, when might the birthplace of the gods be established? Because this is my particular area of expertise, finding out the age of things. Well, if the Uruku were navigating the Pacific before the flood, they could have been in New Zealand before 10,000 BC. So that's a basic logic. Well, Waitaha describe a calendar stone in this valley. Well, if we could find that calendar stone, it will help tremendously the dating of the actual site. Well, years of search continued. I walked along this valley for 6 years, like I said. Nothing resembling a calendar stone ever popped up. And then I decided to, on my last trip, to focus on a third site, which few people know about, and it's rarely visited, and it's called Flock Hill. And there are hundreds and hundreds of eroded limestone outcrops, and they're all natural, but some of them are suspiciously unusual. They don't behave like eroded limestone outcrops. And I was, remember just walking around after about an hour, wondering, what the hell am I doing on this ridge? And I figured, what exactly am I looking for? When the only bird, and I mean the only bird in the entire valley, a falcon no less, lands on this rock. Now, if I was an ancient Egyptian, I would have thought, thank you, Horus. Why are you sitting on this very large monolith? Well, it turns out that on close inspection, it does actually look like a hand-carved monument, which is now very eroded. Here's a close-up of it, which shows that it's a disc with a sundial. It actually looks like a sundial with what looks like 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. It's barely perceived today, and you can, Water does not behave like this. This is definitely something that's been eroded for a very, very long time, and yet the protrusions on that little knob are still quite definite. Is it possible that I'm making this up? Well, let's take a look at this. Let's first of all, in order to understand the dating of things, what are we looking for? Because it could be the sunrise, it could be the sunset, it could be the moon, it could be a constellation. Well, now you have to look into the mythology of the Waitaha. And their prime constellations, their principal points in the sky are Orion and the Southern Cross. So using the art of archaeoastronomy, we can now roll the sky back in time and find out, is there a relationship between the orientation of the stone and the sky at some particularly remote time? Well, the first sighting of the Southern Cross, when it appears above the stone, is on the spring equinox of 14,800 BC, which means, if correct, the Uruku were here before the first of the three ice ages, which is the oldest, driest event. Now, I posit that this perhaps is a bit too old for some people to appreciate, and I myself, I'm even a little skeptical about this. Could people have been in New Zealand at that remote period? We simply don't know. So I began to look at the second possibility, which is Orion. Now, things really began to happen here, because the first time you see the belt of Orion above that little knob is again on the spring equinox of 10,800 BC. And it's exactly the period of the meteorite impacts that started the Younger Dryas. So the question is, did the Uruku move here after the event and they began this birthplace of the gods, or were they already here before the event? Well, the other question is, when does the entire constellation appear for the first time above this calendar stone? It appears again on the spring equinox in 10,400 BC. And at the very same moment that you are looking at this, if you go to the other side of the valley and you go back to Kura-Ti, well, Martine is gazing at the Southern Cross and the Milky Way rising vertically at the same moment. So that's a dual reference offering a high probability that the Uruku were indeed commemorating this date at the birthplace of the gods. Now, any of you who are familiar with this ancient system of knowledge, you may find this date a little bit familiar. Where have we seen this sky, ground, and date correlation? Well, we have found it at Tiwanaku and the three pyramids that mirrored Orion's belt, and of course, Robert Bauval and Adrian Gilbert's calculation for the Giza Plateau. So there are overlapping relationships between the flood gods of Egypt and the Uruku as well. So it's not just the monuments, it's the people who erected these sites on two opposite sides of the planet. And I'll come back to this later to keep this a little bit sane and somehow memorable. Well, when the Uruku returned from New Zealand, they would have to bypass Easter Island to visit Kainga Nui Nui, which means the great land in the east, the place of ancestors where they were already established. Well, where is Kainga Nui Nui? Well, there are two possibilities. One, there's a missing land of gods that's now sunk between Easter Island and South America. And there is a substantial evidence to back this up from, again, the missing lands that we found only in the 18th century, and also from the stories of people in the Pacific as well. However, if you take a second possibility, there is part of the story of the Uruku and the Waitaha talk about how that when they made this voyage from New Zealand to this missing land, they took two totem birds with them. And one was named Titi and one was named Kaka. And together they form the name Titicaca, which is the home of the temple city of Tiwanaku. And here we are. The etymology of Tiwanaku reveals information about its origin and purpose. For example, it's not a modern word. Tiwanaku is actually an Aymara word, which means you have to understand Aymara. And it's actually, when you put it into Aymara, it's actually Te Wanaku, and it means my people, okay, or the city of my people. Except there's a problem here, because the syllable aku is not Aymara, it is Egyptian, and it means shining being. So Tiwanaku is best described as the city of my shining beings or my shining people. But what makes this city an antediluvian site? Well, Excavations of the nearby temple of the called Kala-Sasaya, which is essentially this massive, massive quadrangle of upright monoliths. Before it was filled in with earth, by the way, because if you've been there, half of this stuff doesn't now exist. This is how it was actually found excavated about 120 years ago. And that this quadrangle was found to be offset from the horizon, excuse me, from the horizon stars by 18 degrees, because in the time it was built and the time that it was measured, the Earth and its background of stars have moved. All the stars have shifted, so the temple and the horizon no longer adds up. So when the calculation was done, and it was found that the stones actually correlated to the horizon in 15,000 BC. So this makes Tiwanaku and Kala-Sasaya one of the oldest temple cities on Earth. And the results were actually validated by 5 mathematicians at the time. But even so, the Kala-Sasaya itself appears to have been forced to fit an existing layout. And here it is. The adjacent temples to the Kala-Sasaya are actually slanted by 3 degrees. There is the semi-subterranean temple, there is the Akapana Mound, and also just down the road, another site called Pumapumku. The fact is that these are found on deeper sediment, which means that they're even older than the Kala-Sasaya itself. And with that 3-degree deviation from the Kala-Sasaya, it means that these sites are not only older, they're also referencing the Earth's meridian in a much earlier era. Well, here's a bit of mathematics for you. It takes the Earth's axis 21,600 years to tilt 3 degrees. And that means it places these earliest of temples around 36,000 BC. Is this too early for a civilization to be up in the Andes? Well, consider for one thing that the start of the Egyptian king list in the Turin Papyrus is dated between 36 to 39,000 BC. So there is a historic precedent for the establishment of civilization in the Egyptian chronicles, which can be correlated to the Andean plateau. And the observation also shows that there were 3 building periods at Tiwanaku. There was a first period, which is very, very remote. There was a second building period, which is clearly seen by the shape and size of the stones, which took place about 15,000 BC, which shows destruction by a massive flood overwhelming the area. In other words, Lake Titicaca literally tipped on its axis, and the entire contents of the lake flowed towards the temple. It dumped people, animals, cooking utensils, all in this terrible conflagration. And then there's a third period of building around there, which is the reconstruction of the temple, followed many thousands of years later by the Inca people, who actually built very little. They inherited very much. So was it the Uruku who returned to Lake Titicaca to rebuild these sites, we wonder? Well, the Aymara and the Pukina, which are even older people than the Aymara, they are said to have fled to the Andes when the floods sank their island continent in the Pacific called Lapukije. And the local people said the nickname of this missing land in the Pacific was called Mu'ul, which of course becomes known as Lemuria. And that's still taught in the local schools around Lake Titicaca, by the way. They're very proud of their heritage. And they said that the temples were rebuilt by a god-man called Vidakosha and 7 craftspeople. And these craftspeople were called the Hai-Hai-Wapanti. When you ask the Aymara what does this word mean, they said it means shining ones, and that's the name that was given to Tiwanaku. Well, if you look carefully at the statue of Vidakosha, which is portrayed here in red scoria in Tiwanaku, by the way, the same stone that's used for the hats of the Moai on Easter Island, you see a snake on the side of the statue, and that was a symbol of office. And that symbol was called the people of the serpent. So that was their symbol, their characteristic emblem. Well, what more do we know about these people of the serpent? Well, the Hai-Hai-Wapanti was said to be very tall, light-skinned, red-haired, and they had beards, which is very rare in the Andes, like I said. And like the Uruku, they too had red hair. And they also had elongated skulls, which is not the result of cranial deformation by the mothers, which is something that came later because they wanted the children to be born to look like the gods. And believe me, when you see deformed craniums, they look stupid. They look like cone heads. But these are not. These are very elegant. And also, these skulls have a 25% larger cranial capacity than human skulls. Now, you can reshape your skull, but you can't increase its cranial capacity. It's genetically impossible. So these are a natural group of people who are very different to us. In fact, the stories from around the world describe these gods as human-like, but not quite human. And the local people were not afraid of these tall people. They were very happy with them. The problem came with their children, which is a completely different story. Now, the DNA of these skulls also tracks them to a region of the Black Sea, Mesopotamia, and also, surprise, surprise, to Egypt. So now the question is, might the Uruku and Viracocha and his shining ones be of Egyptian origin? Here we are at the Temple of Edfu, one of my favorite places on earth. The walls are covered with something called the building texts. The Greeks found them in disarray, in bits and pieces, and they literally put the information on the walls. It's a massive library in stone. And they talk about how after the partial destruction of the island of the gods, the homeland of the gods established a presence along the Nile. And the story coincides with the Younger Dryas after 10,800 BC. Now, this is the funny thing, because when these gods apparently appear after the first ice age, and they're looking for somewhere else to live because their sea levels are rising and they have to find new places to live. Well, they began to leave their homeland somewhere around the world, around 10,800 BC, and they settled in Egypt. And the funny thing is that their arrival coincides with an agricultural revolution along the Nile in 10,500 BC. It's an anomaly. And the only way it could have happened is if someone had imported agriculture to the area. So there is a correlation here in terms of archaeology and also mythology. The sad part of the story is that within 800 years of the arrival of the gods in Egypt, a second disaster sank their island nation, pretty much for good. Whereupon the surviving groups of gods who were lucky enough to find themselves in the middle of the ocean and not be overwhelmed by these titanic waves, returned to Egypt to, and I quote, rebuild the former mansions of the gods. And the text also adds other islands to the litany of islands from where they came from. One of them is called Iutiti, which kind of means the island of beauty. And I wondered, is this their reference to Titicaca and the temple of Tiwanaku? Don't know, but it's the etymological connection is certainly there. What is there is the fact that the gods of Egypt were called the Aku Shemsu Hor, which translates as shining ones, followers of Horus. So in other words, these gods are exactly the same people as Viracocha and company, and the gods of Egypt also arrive in groups of 7 with one charismatic leader. So we now have an overlap with all of these stories. And they too are described as light-skinned, between 8.5 and 10 feet tall, with red hair and elongated skulls. They're often described as the builder gods because they came back to Egypt to build the mansions of the gods. Well, that was the first question I wanted to ask myself. What might they have been building? Well, the building texts commemorate their arrival as the first occasion, and the date is commemorated in the alignment of the Giza pyramids at 10,400 BC on the spring equinox, along with the pyramids of Dashur, by the way. But there's at least one site that I believe may even be older, and it's right here. It's called the Osirian, from which I just come back from, by the way, leading a very happy and successful tour. I wasn't going to show the suntan, but I'm sorry, we're live. Well, this is a kind of a rebuilding of the diagram of what the Osirian used to look like. It was once considered an underground temple and still is by most mainstream academia. There's only one problem with this theory. That is that the temple was actually underground because of the accumulation of silt around its walls 40 to 50 feet of silt. And that accumulation of silt is only consistent when the Nile Valley was much wetter, which is the period between 10,500 BC and 8,000 BC, which created major flooding and of course led to major silt deposits. So that means that the temple had to have been there before the silting began. So it puts us in a time period around 8,000 BC. Then in 1300 BC, Seti I built his temple adjacent to it above the ground. It's a beautiful temple. It bears absolutely no relationship architecturally to the one below, but it does share the same axis as the Osirian. So in other words, Seti must have rediscovered the Osirian because he couldn't have just placed his temple on the same axis by accident unless he was exceptionally psychic. Well, his temple stops just short of the Osirian and then bends to the left, which is a complete contradiction of temple design. Because what he's doing here, he is divorcing the Holy of Holies, which is the head of the body, sorry, the head of the temple from the body of the temple. That just doesn't happen in Egyptian temple building. And Seti was a very astute student of the mysteries. He would have known better to do that. So my theory is that Seti may have rediscovered the Osirian, which by his time was already underground, and then he tried to build his temple on top. And then the weight of this temple collapsed the ceiling of the Osirian, which probably was already compromised due to the exceptional earthquakes in this region. Well, now we have to ask ourselves exactly how old is the Osirian? Well, let's look at the name. It's named for Osiris, who is the embodiment of the constellation of Orion. And yet neither the Osirian nor Seti's temple faces Orion in the past 15,000 years. Now, that was a big surprise to me. I thought that this would be a very easy kind of thing to figure out. So it took a couple of years to go back to Seti's temple looking for clues, and he left one clue in the last chamber, right the very corner of the room, the very place where most people don't bother to look. And of course, if you're an astute observer of the mysteries, you follow the clue to its least possible destination because that's where you find all the gold. So here it is. It's a panel, beautifully carved on the wall, and it's actually in the chapel number 8 in Seti's temple. And the panel depicts Osiris's consort Isis as the hawk of Osiris. And her outstretched wings demonstrate the ability to fan the breath of immortality into Osiris. But for this to occur, the soul of the hero must reside in the region of regeneration, which is the pole star, which is protected by 7 circumpolar stars called the Indestructibles. So perhaps we should be looking for a hawk constellation instead of Orion in relation to the Osirian. Well, back in 10,500 BC, the star Deneb was one of those indestructible stars. And Deneb is the brightest star in the constellation of Cygnus. But Cygnus was not regarded as a swan back in the day. It was regarded as a hawk. And therein lies the connection with Osiris, the woman who resurrects her soul, and the archaeoastronomical date when the Osirian was most likely built. If you're standing on in the middle of the Osirian back in the spring equinox of 10,500 BC, you would have seen a perfect match between the temple and the sky, because Cygnus, the hawk, appears to ascend upright along a vertical Milky Way. So literally, it's floating on a river towards a pole. That's an incredible theatrical moment. But the best part is that the star Deneb would have been perfectly framed by the actual entrance. And in case you're paying attention, the photograph shows the rear of the temple because it makes it easier to demonstrate what I'm talking about. So this wonderful connection of the Milky Way as a vertical ladder and the hawk rising vertically through the front door with the star Deneb would have made a fantastic sight, and it would have not been missed and lost on people for whom the sky and ground relationship was very, very important. So we now have the shining ones present before and after the flood in both Egypt and the Andes and also the Pacific. These groups are described as master seafarers and astronomers, and they share identical megalithic building methods. And in turn, Viracocha and his shining ones resemble the Uruku of New Zealand and Easter Islands. They are the same red-haired, light-skinned, seafaring astronomers who employed identical building methods throughout the Pacific. And as for the Uruku, they may be the same as the followers of Horus, because both of their leaders were red-haired navigators and astronomers, and both held the title Net of the World for their ability to map the rearranged lands after the flood. And here they are depicted on the panel of the Temple of Edfu. At least, what, 4,500 miles away from New Zealand? And all of the three groups of gods share another point in common. They are all associated with Orion. So I posit that these are probably the same people, the same brother and sisterhood, and they may have lived in different parts of the world. So now the question is, could they have also been present in the Atlantic Ocean? Well, let's find out. Even if you discount a major subsidence in the mid-Atlantic ridge due to damage from meteoric impacts and rising sea levels 11,000 years ago, the Azores were still a formidable archipelago back then. And bathymetric maps of the region even bear some resemblance to the continent depicted on ancient maps, that kind of triangular shape. But note also that in the map, north is pointing south. Now, the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Egyptians all claimed that the Earth's poles were reversed at this point, which is what caused the beginning of the last ice age. So I believe that the map may be an echo of traditions that were being pushed around Europe. And at the beginning, I asked, can a land sink in the blink of a geological eye? Well, as recent history shows, yes, it can. But an island the size of a continent, well, that's something very different, isn't it? Well, perhaps. Rocks that were recovered at a depth of 6,000 feet around the Azores actually show signs of exposure to oxygen, while sediment taken from the mid-Atlantic ridge reveals the remains of freshwater plants and beach sand created along a shoreline. And it indicates that this part of the Atlantic was still above sea level around 15,000 BC, before the date of the first of the three cataclysms. So where is the evidence for its pre-flood civilization, I hear you say? Well, here's a funny story for you. I was actually on my way to Portugal via the Azores, and I landed in the main island just in time for the, I was going to say the pub, I'm thinking of England, for the cafe to open. And the newspapers were being dished out, and in one of the headlines it said, Silva discovers underwater pyramid. And I wondered, what the hell was I doing when I was asleep on a plane, I wonder. Of course, it turns out to be a completely different Silva. This was Diociclitano Silva, and he found himself a pyramid, a submerged pyramid, 100-foot tall, and it's 180 feet below sea level. And here are the sonar images of what he actually found. Well, the Portuguese Navy investigated his claims and said Silva is mistaken. Well, what a surprise. It's just a seamount. Of course it is. It's a step pyramid, perfectly aligned to grid north. Nature does incredible things sometimes, doesn't it? Well, it turns out that the Navy actually searched the wrong area, and it was pointed out to them, to which point they replied, well, Silva actually had the GPS coordinates completely wrong, which makes you wonder, how did this fisherman ever get home safely 20 years going out fishing in the mid-Atlantic out of sight of the islands with faulty equipment? It does beg a belief, doesn't it? Some of these official explanations you wish to just quit while they're still ahead. Well, I thought it was very exciting when he discovered this, and perhaps he discovered what I've been looking for all along, because back when I wrote my second book, The Divine Blueprint, I actually laid out a world grip of some of the ancient sites of the world and how they are mathematically positioned around the world. Graham Hancock, my colleague, also came up with the same idea, and we worked independently and reached very similar conclusions. And the one place that was missing was right down the mid-Atlantic ridge, because there's nothing there. Well, I thought we'd struck gold, but if you look at where the Azores pyramid is located, it's actually it's a few degrees off from where it ought to be, where the main location ought to be. So if there are any of you amateur sailors watching right now, here are the coordinates, the mathematical coordinates where I propose a major city complex actually is. And if you find it, please send back really good photographs and I'll buy you a bottle of really good scotch. And by the way, if you're very observant, look at that, the island of San Miguel, which is the lowest one on the picture, and look at that depression, that circular depression around it. Are we looking here at a massive meteor crater, or are we dealing here with a sunken caldera? Because the islands are very, very volcanic. We may have here evidence of a major collapse, either from the sky or from the ground, and it bears further examination. Well, having said that, whatever happened to the gods of Atlantis? Because this is obviously the place where we should be looking. Well, the traditions at the end of the Younger Dryas describe how one group of gods sailed east after the flood. They ended up just on the to the west of Lisbon, ironically, exactly where I was born, and they were called the Off-User. They were described, actually, they're not described. The name literally means the people of the serpent. So we're talking about the very same gods of Egypt, of South America, and so forth. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the Atlantic, we have an identical story. We have groups of sages, people arriving in the Yucatan Peninsula. And they were described as migrating from stepping stone to stepping stone from the east on a raft of serpents, which of course is a bit funny when you read that. Were they that desperate to escape a sinking landmass that they would even go into a boat filled with snakes? I don't think that story actually adds up very well. What the story is telling you is that the people inside the raft or the canoe were serpent people. That makes a lot more sense. And they were hopping literally from island to island because that's all that was remained of their original island, which they called Atl, which of course is the origin of the name Atitlan and then Atlantic. Now, in the Chilam Balam, which is the sacred book of the Yucatan, it actually dates this event 9,600 BC, which is just within 100 years of when geologists have actually dated the catastrophe of the flood. It's an important date because it is identical to the date given by the Egyptian priest to that visiting Greek scholar called Solon for the sinking of the homeland of the gods. So Plato's story of Atlantis actually is verified by the Chilam Balam on the opposite side of the world. What about these gods? These gods were called Its, which literally means sorcerer, magician. And their title of office, like I said, was the Kanul. It means people of the serpent. And it was also the title given to the people of South America. So at the one stroke, it links the flood gods of Yucatan with South America and also of Mesopotamia, because they had the same title of office there as well. The Its were described as architects of the sky. They spoke a language called Hesuyatao, which means the language of light. What a great description. And nothing more is known about this language of light. And they arrived in groups of 7, yet again, led by an 8th charismatic leader called Itzamna. It's a guy, a godman who we get to hear very little about, but he is described as a tall, light-skinned, long-bearded man with very Caucasian features. And here he is on the left, still portrayed on an eroded wall at Chichen Itza. And the same description is given to 2 other leaders of these canoes who landed in 2 other parts of the Yucatan. One of them is called Kukulkan, and the other one you'll know very well. His name is Quetzalcoatl, and there he is, the serpent person. So these are actually, by the way, not names. They were titles. There were many Quetzalcoatl and many Kukulkan, which of course drives historians absolutely crazy and makes the dating of things for them very, very difficult. But people in the Maya world know very different, and they don't really talk to outsiders about it. Well, the Its, these very unusual people, moved across the Yucatan. They established temple cities like Chichen Itza, which bears their name. And then they continued inland and into mountains, far away from the ocean, which is very sensible. And they built the original Tikal, the original Uxmal, and the temple cities that reflected the architecture of their homeland, but also of the cosmos. So what you're looking at here is not just a pyramid, it's a library in stone. They describe them as astral academies, each building encoded with knowledge of mathematics, science, and astronomy, information brought from their original homeland and built using huge monuments to ensure the knowledge would survive future cataclysms. And the buildings were rebuilt over and over and over. So what we see today is, for example, is the fifth iteration of the building. There are 5 other pyramids inside this and many other buildings. So when people say, yeah, this was built in historical times, it's absolutely correct. What is not correct is the fact that they are hiding even all the structures, which rarely gets talked about. So these magician gods, the Its, continued deeper into the highlands of Guatemala, and they eventually settled on a lake that they called Atitlan, which was named for the sunken island continent they had once lost. And in the middle, they built the city of Utitlan, which then sank during a massive volcanic eruption. And you'd think after what they'd been through on a volcanic island in the Atlantic, they would have moved somewhere less volatile, but I guess old habits die hard. So they eventually rebuilt Utitlan on the shore of Utitlan, and part of the remains are still there today. Not many. They've all been plundered for local building material. Their other main center, however, does survive quite well, and it's right here. It's called Te Itza, which is actually an Egyptian and a Polynesian name, oddly enough, and it sits on the island of Lake Peten Itza. And again, it was chosen to reflect the original Atlantic island home. And the name means the great islands of the Its. But if you look carefully at the map, it's not a great island at all. There's a much bigger one off to the top left-hand corner. So why is this island, the big island, which is the bigger one next door? Well, it turns out that Te Itza, which is today called Flores, by the way, it was their main spiritual center, and it comprised 21 temples and a big pyramid. And that's what made it big. And its strategic placement, looking down the neck of the lake, is why it was chosen over the large islands. Now, here's how I found this out. Here is the center of Flores today. I reasoned that the Spanish built their church over the original pyramid because it was standard Catholic practice to hide things and use the temples of the ancients as building material. Well, how can we be certain that this is correct? Well, one, because it was Catholic practice to align their churches east to west, except that this church is aligned 132 degrees east-southeast. When that happens, and especially in Europe, it means it's hiding an earlier temple. They don't want you to know it's there, but of course, paradoxically, by not aligning the temple east-west, they are giving the game away. When I mentioned this to the local bishop, I was escorted out of the building immediately, and that also told me that I was on the right path of inquiry. And since the church sits on the highest ground, it allows a beautiful view of the horizon down the long neck of the lake. All you have to do now is stand there and take a bead down the neck of the neck and find out, well, what was happening here that made this position so important? What were they looking at 132 degrees east-southeast? Well, when you take a bead down the lake, the only alignment that makes sense is that it's marking the winter solstice sunrise in 7,600 BC. So within 1,000 years, the Its had already moved deep into the mountains of Guatemala. And the Maya do acknowledge their own tradition to be a continuation of the traditions founded by the Its. Maya is really a name of a belief system, not necessarily a people. And the Maya really come into their own as a people in 3100 BC, ironically at the same time that the first pharaoh, and I quote, of a purely human bloodline takes the throne of Egypt. So there is an overlap between the gods of Egypt and the Maya world, even in historical times. There's a clue that lies in the Maya serpent dynasty because it is said to cover over 16,000 years. In other words, the dynasty of the Maya precedes the flood, and it probably began elsewhere in a missing land now in the middle of the Atlantic. Because if you remember correctly, the surviving gods moved to the mainland of around the world to rebuild the former world of the gods. They were carrying on from where they left off. And in fact, evidence for this is now coming up in the archaeological record as well. In this picture, you'll see that there's an older age to the pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza, because one of the lower layers have now been discovered, and it was described as being built originally by a serpent priest. And I am told from one of the archaeologists there are still many other layers to go underneath this one. So we'll wait to see what happens. Well, can the Maya dynasty really be that old? Well, let's take a look. Consider that 358 submerged cave systems have been found near the Temple of Tulum on the coast of Yucatan. And they contain the remains of enormous sloths, proto-elephants, extinct fauna, and Maya human remains and artifacts. And they were all trapped in the cave by rising water levels by 8,000 BC. So the culture has to precede that time. And it's proving that myths that people lived in this region when the flood struck, and whose survivors witnessed the arrival of the Its from a sunken continent. And these people of the serpent were also present in other parts of the world. In the Far East, for example, there's a wonderful coincidence. Itzamna, who happens to be one of the gods of the Yucatan, happens to be a compound name of the two gods who were the builders of civilization around the flood in Japan in 8,000 BC, and they're called Izanami and Izanagi. And their lineage also encompasses Indochina, where they were also known as the dragon bloodline of the Chinese continent and the entire region of Indochina. But they were also active in Polynesia and particularly Fiji. And later, or possibly the same time, we are not certain, also in India, because they were called the Naga people, which means serpent. And all the priests associated with the Naga bloodline were also described as serpent people. So every local tradition describes these heroes emerging from a flood, accompanied by 7 sages who instructed humans on civilization. They built megalithic structures and behaved like magicians. And again, they were always light-skinned, red-haired and green-eyed, or blonde with blue eyes, very tall and with long beards. The region where all of these stories, people, names, and attributes converge is Upper Mesopotamia, where we find a kind of missing land. And it's actually the lost hill of Göbekli Tepe. Sometimes these things, in terms of an island of the gods, is also a place that behaves like an island, a place that's remote from everyone else. So here we are in Göbekli Tepe. The whole mountain is artificial. They've so far found 53 stone circles. They've only dug up about 6 of them, and they're going to be kept very busy for the next 150 years, unless they get some volunteers. So if you have nothing better to do, pack your bags off to northern Turkey. There have been very reliable carbon-14 tests made of the organic material at this site, and the average dating is 9,984 BC. So it precedes, most of these circles precede the Great Flood. The problem there is that the samples were taken from the walls, and if you look carefully at the walls of, let's say, structure D, which is its most famous structure, excuse me, you find that these walls are actually obscuring important details on the pillars. So the walls were obviously added much later when the site was decommissioned and very carefully and deliberately buried. So when might these structures themselves have been built? Well, for this, we turn again to the stars to see if we can get an alignment. So let's again concentrate on enclosure D, because it has a lot of decorations and it gives us some clues as to what they may be observing in the sky. It has been suggested that the alignment of Göbekli Tepe is to the northern setting of Sirius. It's an elegant idea, but there's a problem because the enclosure sits below the summit by 30 feet. There's a great big mound of rock in front of you, which makes it very hard to measure the sky with the hill obstructing your line of vision. And secondly, and most importantly, ancient people rarely, if ever, celebrated the descent of a celestial object. They only celebrated the rising or the midheaven elevation. Let's take the earliest carbon-14 date of the site, which is 10,200 BC. Well, now a number of things begin to emerge. If we take the view on the winter solstice of 10,400 BC, yes, we do see seasickness descending behind the hill. But the only clear view of the north is the path of the pole star and its Vega and its elliptical rotation around the celestial pole, framed by the two T pillars. And those pillars are pillar 43. The two T pillars that stand in the middle of the enclosure. And pillar 43 actually marks the starting point of Vega's observation from that location. So there is an actual way you can actually see the pole star at the time using this basic observational technique. And this is the pillar where you'll find the carving of vultures revolving around a circle. Now, Vega, the name comes from the word waki, which means falling or swooping. And it refers to the motion of its host constellation Lyra, resembling a swooping vulture. So it appears that the pillar is accurately depicting the behavior of Vega and Lyra around the celestial pole. The only clear sight line of the enclosure, when you actually stand there, is actually to the southeast. And when you do this, when Vega is visible behind you in the north, if you look into the southeast, the belt of Orion rises briefly above the horizon for the first time, its narrow arc framed by pillars 19 and 32, with pillar 33 marking its highest ascension. So we have here a very good, I'd say a very solid foundation for archaeoastronomy at Göbekli Tepe. This reference raises an important issue too, because specifically with regard to Giza, where the same relationship takes place on the very same date. Well, what is the connection between Göbekli Tepe and Giza, which is about, I believe it's about 800 miles to the south? Well, this is where the understanding of place names comes in really, really useful. Because, you know, back in the day, objects and people were given names that embodied an event or a function that defined their purpose, so it would be remembered by future generations. They didn't just hand out names because they felt like it. Well, let's take a look at Göbekli Tepe. It is not the original name of the mountain. The original name is an Armenian word called Portasar. And port is very easy to understand. It means umbilical cord or navel. Asar is a bit more of a problem. It's actually not Armenian at all. It's the Egyptian name for Osiris. Osiris is a Greek transliteration of Asar. So now we consider Göbekli Tepe means the umbilical cord of Osiris. Why would the umbilical cord of Osiris be in this part of Upper Mesopotamia, I wonder? Well, if you look at Osiris himself, he, of course, is the earthly embodiment of Orion, and his dwelling place is said to be the Giza Plateau. So there is a suggestion here in the name that Göbekli Tepe and Giza are somehow linked by some kind of invisible umbilical cord. So is this what the umbilical cord is referring to? When you draw a cord from the corner of the pyramid of Menkaure through to the corner of the pyramid of Khufu, you end up at Göbekli Tepe. So this is Göbekli Tepe is now the second dwelling place of Osiris. There is a figurative umbilical cord between the two sites. So in other words, there's a geodetic link between these two locations. The two are somehow related in a way we still don't quite understand. It's a work in progress. So let's now recall the story about the flood gods of Egypt. The Shining Ones, followers of Horus. Might they be connected to Göbekli Tepe, and might this help us understand this story a little bit further? Well, the hill's deliberate southeast view is not just of Orion, it also offers a sightline to an ancient astronomical tower in the town of Haran. And there have been human activity in Haran for the last 10,000 years. In 8000 BC, archaeological digs have found human remains dating to as far back as 8000 BC. So we could say it's almost contemporary with the last stage of Göbekli Tepe. But Haran is not the real name of Haran. Its original name was Har-Anu. It means the enclosure of Anu, which now, of course, begs the question, who or what was Anu? In the Mesopotamian tradition, 200 years before the flood, there is a scribe by the name of Enmed-Ur-Anu who writes down his encounters with an unusual people of his own lineage, and they are called the Lords of Anu. They are collectively known as the people of Anu, or better known to you and I as Anunnaki. And the Anu also appeared in India as the Anu Naga, which means the people of the serpent. So there's another connection there. Well, meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the Maya also knew the Anunnaki because they refer to them as the Chak Zai Unkob. It means the red ant men, because they labored to create order out of nature, just as industrial red ants tend to do. However, the metaphor also described the relationship between these gods and the three belt stars of Orion's belt, which resembled a tripartite body of an ant. But then the story doesn't end there, because the Hopi to the north also knew the red ant people. They called them the Anunnaki, and it literally transcribes as ant father home. And their leader was a man by the name of Anu Sinom, which means an ant person. The Hopi described the Anu Sinom as an unusual humanoid, generous and hardworking, who helped the people survive the Younger Dryas cataclysm and reach the safety of the southwest of the United States, where he lends his name to the first people of the region, the Hizat Sinom, which then became known as the Anasazi, or perhaps they were named originally the Anusazi. We don't know. Well, it is the Anu, certainly, who are depicted on this beautiful panel in Horseshoe Valley in Utah, which requires a 5-hour trek with 5 gallons of water on your back. And believe me, the best hike, one of the best hikes I've ever done in the world, and it's definitely worth seeing, just for the peace and quiet alone. Look carefully at the panel. They are life-size, they're over 8.5 feet tall, and there are 7 people with one charismatic leader with the big eyes. And on the panel next to it is the serpent motif, which offers the badge of office. So here we also have the Anunnaki as the people of the serpent. Well, back in Mesopotamia, the Anu are described as unusually tall, light-skinned, stop me if this sounds tedious, but they also required the anointing with oil because they had the problem with the sun. They had to keep rubbing some kind of oil on their skin, and it gave their skin a shining appearance. And this is where their nickname comes from, the Shining Ones. But it also was a metaphor because it defined these sages as enlightened people. When you are enlightened, when you are knowledgeable, there's a shine about you. There's a certain glow to your presence, to your aura. Well, if we place the Anunnaki in context with other flood gods, they are essentially, and I have a diagram for this, they are also Viracocha and his Shining Ones of the Andes, who are the Uruku of New Zealand and Easter Island, who are the Aku Shemsu Hor, the Shining Ones, following horrors of Egypt. And under the title People of the Serpent, they are also the Kanul of Central America, the Ofusa of Portugal, and the Naga of Japan, China, Indonesia, Polynesia, and India. They are one and the same international group of sages, craftspeople, masters of the natural arts, human-like, but not quite human. International people of mystery, as Austin Powers would say. Well, it may explain the influence of so much Egyptian language throughout Polynesia. For example, there's an island in Fiji called Ra-Iatea, which in Egyptian means the white-skinned people of Ra. And in the Solomon Islands, there is Izatabu, which means the restricted sacred abode of Isis. Now, what would these people, Egyptian people, be doing in the middle of Polynesia, I wonder? Not to mention, of course, the existence of identical building techniques that stretch like an umbilical cord from Egypt through the Central Pacific and all the way to the Andes. So there's a fingerprint here of just not language, but physiognomy and also architecture. Well, the Lords of Anu, getting back to them, they oversaw, surprise, surprise, 7 groups of 7 lords. And these lords were called the Apkallu. It means a sage, a master of the craft. And they are nicknamed the Watchers, which means messenger. Now, if you've been following Sitchin and Ancient Aliens, I'm very sorry to tell you that these were essentially given a very, very bad name. For slightly good reasons. They are discredited in Hebrew and Jewish texts for purely political and religious reasons, because in the time period in which the Bible was being created, the Hebrew and Jewish people needed to create a superiority over the other tribes in the region. So they cast the Watchers and the Anunnaki and the Apkallu as demons, whereas actually they were very highly enlightened people. They are described in original texts as the helpers of humanity, and they are acknowledged by such as by indigenous cultures such as the Hopi and the Zuni, who call them the lookers. So these are the watchers in their language, and they are said to have assisted the Hopi Snake clan from a sinking island in the Pacific to settle in Betatakin, which is a cave dwelling in Arizona, and one of the most beautiful cave dwellings in Arizona, back when, of course, they were called the Hizatsinon. So these people were very, very helpful. It was the small group of watchers, the narrow group of watchers, who defied orders, went down and hang out with human women, bore their children, and that's where the problems began. But of course, that paints a whole bad picture of the Anunnaki and their watchers. So we need to get away from that story, because these people were actually very enlightened, very helpful. And here they are back in Mesopotamia. There are these figurines called the Mazari, which were placed at the corners of sacred buildings to protect them against evil. And the Mazari means watchers, awakened ones. So the metaphor is that the watchers were both guardians and enlightened people. And if they were protectors of sacred buildings, obviously they were not malevolent, they were not evil people. So this is part of my mission, to try and rebuild the credibility of these people who have been very madly aligned on television, which is why I don't get invited to Ancient Aliens very often. But that's life. It's called real research, people. So the Watchers and the Lords of Anu were distinguishable from humans insofar as they possessed knowledge of the mechanics of nature and how to manipulate it, and thus they were compared to gods. And it was a view also held by the Egyptians, who referred to them as Ushu, which means watchers, and Neter, which means a force of nature, a god. So in other words, if you were a normal person like myself and you mastered a certain law of nature, you become as a god. That's what a god means to these people. Not a white guy with white beard sitting on a throne up in heaven. Anyone can become a god even today if you master the art of the force of nature. So where might these people have lived, I wonder? Well, the Mesopotamian traditions hint that the flood gods lived in 7 secluded locations, possibly 8. I'm still working on this. And so far, we have identified Atal, we have identified Mu'ul, also known as Lapokiji and Lemuria. We have Kashkara, which is identified by the Hopi in the Pacific. Kainga Nui Nui, which is also in the Pacific. We have the birthplace of the gods in New Zealand, and Tiwanaku, or Iutiti. So we're making a bit of progress trying to figure out all of these places of missing lands where the gods used to live. But the assembly of the Lords of Anu itself is said to have been on a mountain called Ardis, which again behaves like an island in itself, which may be located in, maybe related to Armenia. Its original name was Masao, which is both the name of the flood god of the Hopi, and it's also the original name of Ararat, the biggest mountain where we find today the eroded hull of a big ark on the side of the mountain. So there is a little bit of basis to this idea that the origin of the Lords of Anu was actually in Armenia. And their compound was at a place called Garsag, and that also has not been properly identified until I met the last wisdom keeper from a hard-to-find Pacific island called Tongareva. And here it is. It's even bloody hard to find on Google Earth. It's part of the Cook Islands, and its tradition states that a group of gods arrived from the Middle East around 3000 BC, which is not really the area which I'm looking at. They were still described as great sages, star navigators, red-haired, fair-skinned, shining people who belonged to a very ancient lineage of wisdom keepers called the Tiwanaku. And when I spoke on the most expensive phone call of my life to the last wisdom keeper of the Cook Islands, he said to me, well, you know them by another name called the Anunnaki. We call them the Tiwanaku. And their presence in the Pacific, he said, is much earlier, around the time of a great flood, and specifically on Easter Island, which where one sacred platform still carries their name to this very day. And here it is. It's called Ahu Anunnaku. And Ahu, the name is a derivative of the Egyptian word Aku, as in Aku Shamsuhor, a shining one. So essentially, it's the platform of the shining people. So the Tonga-Raven traditions also go on to state that the original homeland of these lords of Anu was actually in the Indian Ocean. And it was described as a secluded circular island by the name of Tepetaka. The tradition states, and again, this was given to me verbally by the last wisdom keeper of the Cook Islands. So it's a wonderful privilege for me to publish this material in my current book. And he was more than happy for me to publish this because the tradition is going to die with him. And he says he's got the actual lineage of all the people that lived on Tiwanaku going back to the earliest times. So it's all catalogued. Well, his tradition states that the region was totally transformed by a cataclysm 11,000 years ago to the point where this island no longer is visible. Because when parts of the Indian Ocean sank, others rose. There was a quid pro quo. And this missing land of the gods existed in the region where today stands, according to this wisdom keeper, the Arabian Peninsula. So somewhere in this region is a missing land, the homeland of the flood gods, shining ones, people of the serpent, Anunnaki, watchers, Viracochas, and so forth. And there are two pieces of circumstantial evidence that point to these master seafarers and astronomers who once lived on this island nation. The first is a monument near now what is the Persian Gulf. It's a monument that is totally out of character for the region. It has been rebuilt, but a visitor from the Andes would come here and look at the style of construction and believe they were still back home, or for that matter, in Egypt, or Easter Island, or the Andes, or Taiwan 11,000 years ago, because it is the same method of construction and design. And the Assyrian, by the way, with the picture in the middle, you still see the knobs on the side of the Assyrian. That's the first piece of evidence. The other piece of evidence is Papyrus 1115. And it talks about a ship the story of the shipwrecked sailors. The story goes something like this. A ship is caught in a storm and all hands perish, except for the narrator, of course, who is shipwrecked on what he believes to be a desert island somewhere in the Indian Ocean. And eventually he meets the leader of this island who gives him food and a boat and returns him home to Egypt because he says, this is the last time you're going to see this island. It's sinking, the sea levels are arriving, and it's going to be gone for certain. Well, it's a wonderful story, but we don't know when this account took place. However, as this shipwrecked sailor embarks back to Egypt, the leader tells the sailor that the sea levels rising, the island is doomed, and the sailor then offers a description of the god who ruled this island. He describes him as a serpent with deep blue eyes and a beard. Well, I don't know about you. I don't know many serpents with blue eyes, especially no serpents I know have a beard. Well, if you look at the story as a metaphor, well, the ancient mariner is describing to us one of the many flood gods who went by the title People of the Serpent, who had, of course, beards and blue eyes. He is also describing one of the missing lands where these extraordinary people once built a memorable world civilization before it succumbed to catastrophe, but not before they gave humans the accoutrements of civilization and empowered us to continue their traditions. As for the other 370 pages of this incredible story, yes, my friends, they're all here in this book and its accompanying DVD.